A judge in Harlem takes dirty money and thinks he's untouchable. Bumpy Johnson walks into that courtroom, sits in the back row, and smiles. The whole room goes quiet. That smile wasn't kindness, it was a promise. Chapter 1. The Envelope. The envelope was thin, not the kind of package that draws attention, just a standard manila fold, passed across a desk in a dim office 2 blocks from the Harlem courthouse. Inside, $3,000 in clean bills. Outside, a judge's signature, scrawled in blue ink like he was signing a grocery receipt. Judge Harold Whitmore had been on the bench for 11 years, long enough to know how things worked, long enough to know when to look the other way. This time, he didn't just look away. He took the money. The case was simple on paper. 2 men, local muscle, tied to a Harlem crew, had been picked up on charges that could have stuck. Assault, racketeering, the kind of charges that put people away for years. But the men who wanted them gone weren't from Harlem. They were from downtown. White money. Old money. The kind that didn't like competition in the numbers racket. Didn't like how organized the black community was becoming. So they paid. And Whitmore took it. He told himself it wasn't personal. Told himself it was just business. Told himself that in a city this big, this corrupt, one decision wouldn't matter. He was wrong. Because in Harlem, everything mattered. Word moved fast in Harlem. Faster than the trains, faster than the cops. A bartender hears something from a clerk. A clerk mentions it to a runner. A runner knows a guy who knows a guy. And eventually, that word reaches the right ears. Bumpy Johnson's ears. He was sitting in the back of Jocko's, a small bar on 145th Street, when the information came to him. A young man named Marcus, one of his watchers, slid into the booth across from him. Marcus didn't waste time. Judge Whitmore buried the Jenkins case. Bumpy didn't look up from his drink, just nodded once. Bribe? $3,000. Came from a lawyer tied to the Genovese outfit. They wanted those boys out of the way. Whitmore made sure the evidence didn't hold. Bumpy took a slow sip, set the glass down gently. His face didn't change. But Marcus had worked for him long enough to know that stillness meant something. When's his next session? Tomorrow, 10 a.m. civil dispute, but he'll be on the bench. Bumpy leaned back. His eyes scanned the room, not looking for anything in particular. Just seeing, always seeing. Who else knows? Street talk, nothing solid yet, but people are asking questions. Bumpy nodded again. He didn't need to say more. Marcus understood. This wasn't just about 2 men getting railroaded. This was about respect. This was about a system that thought it could play Harlem for fools. And Bumpy Johnson didn't allow that. Not in his city. That night, Bumpy didn't call a meeting, didn't gather his men, didn't make threats or plans for retaliation. He just sat in his apartment, looking out over the streets of Harlem, the lights, the people, the life. This was his responsibility. Not because he wanted power, not because he loved violence, but because someone had to stand between the wolves and the people who couldn't fight back, and someone had to remind the world that Harlem wasn't for sale. He thought about Judge Whitmore, a man who wore a robe and sat high above everyone else, pretending to serve justice, a man who took money to bury the truth, a man who thought his position made him untouchable. Bumpy had seen men like that before. Men who believed their titles protected them. Men who forgot that power without principle is just fear in a suit. And fear always breaks. Bumpy stood, walked to his closet, and pulled out his best suit. Charcoal gray, clean lines, the kind of suit that said, "I belong anywhere I choose to be." Tomorrow he would go to that courthouse, not with guns, not with threats, just with presence. Because sometimes, that's all it takes. Chapter 2. The Weight of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson didn't build his reputation overnight. It wasn't handed to him, wasn't inherited. It was earned, brick by brick, decision by decision, over decades of walking a line most men couldn't even see. He came up in a Harlem that was still finding itself, a neighborhood caught between the violence of Prohibition and the promise of the Renaissance. a place where black excellence lived next door to black struggle, where jazz filled the air, but so did gunshots. Bumpy learned early, chaos is easy. Any fool with a gun can create fear, but order, respect, that takes something else. It takes presence, consistency, a code, and most importantly, it takes knowing when not to pull the trigger. By the time Judge Whitmore took that envelope, Bumpy had been the quiet king of Harlem for years. Not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the most respected. He ran the numbers. Protected the local businesses, kept outside gangs from moving in. And when disputes came up, because they always did, people came to him. Not to the police, not to the courts, to Bumpy, because they trusted him. That trust wasn't blind. It was earned through principle. Bumpy had rules, and he lived by them. Don't harm the innocent. Don't let outsiders control what's ours. Don't sell out your own people. Judge Whitmore had broken the third rule, and in doing so, he'd threatened the first two. The morning after Marcus brought him the news, Bumpy walked through his neighborhood. He didn't announce himself, didn't need to. People saw him and nodded. Some smiled, others just watched with quiet respect. He stopped by a corner store owned by an older woman named Miss Lorraine. She'd been there 30 years, raised 3 kids in Harlem, buried a husband, survived everything the city could throw at her. She was sweeping the front step when Bumpy approached. "Morning, Miss Lorraine." She looked up and smiled. "Bumpy, you want your usual?" "Just came to say hello." She studied him for a moment. That look older women have, like they can see straight through you. "Something on your mind?" Bumpy leaned against the doorframe, casual, but his voice was serious. "You hear about the Jenkins boys?" Her face darkened. "I heard." Judge threw the case out. Said the evidence was bad. It wasn't bad. It was bought. Miss Lorraine's jaw tightened. "Figures. They always find a way to protect their own and bury ours." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Not this time." She looked at him, searching his face. Then she nodded, understanding without needing details. "You be careful." Bumpy. Always am. He made 2 more stops that morning, a barber shop, a church. Just listening, just watching. Everywhere he went, the same tension, the same quiet anger. People weren't shouting about it. Harlem didn't work like that, but they were talking. And when people talk long enough, things happen. Bumpy knew that better than anyone. He also knew that if he did nothing, someone else would. Some young hothead looking to make a name. Some crew looking to prove they didn't need Bumpy's permission. And that would lead to violence, real violence. The kind that brings police, the kind that gets people killed. That's what men like Judge Whitmore didn't understand. When you corrupt the system, you don't just break the law, you break the peace. You force people to choose between justice and survival. And when people feel like they have no other choice, they stop asking permission. Bumpy wasn't going to let it get that far. He returned home just before noon, sat in his chair by the window. The courtroom session was tomorrow. He had time. But time wasn't the issue. The issue was message. If he went in too hard, he'd prove he was no different than the gangsters people feared. If he went in too soft, the message wouldn't land. Whitmore would think he got away with it. Others would think Harlem could be bought. Bumpy needed something in between. Something that said, "I see you. I know what you did. And you will answer for it." But without a single threat. Without a single law broken. He thought about his mentor, Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Harlem. She'd taught him early. Power isn't about what you do. It's about what people think you'll do. Bumpy smiled to himself. He knew exactly what to do. That evening, he pressed his suit, shined his shoes, trimmed his mustache in the mirror. He looked at his reflection, not with vanity, but with purpose. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be Bumpy Johnson the gangster. He wouldn't be Bumpy Johnson the enforcer. He would be Bumpy Johnson the citizen, walking into a public courtroom, sitting in a public seat, doing nothing illegal. And that would be the most terrifying thing Judge Harold Whitmore had ever seen. Because in Harlem, everyone knew. When Bumpy Johnson shows up and does nothing, something is about to happen. Chapter 3. The Courtroom. The Harlem courthouse sat on 121st Street like a monument to something it had never been. Justice. It was a gray stone building with tall windows and marble steps. The kind of architecture meant to make you feel small, meant to remind you that the law was bigger than you, older than you, untouchable. But Bumpy Johnson had never felt small in his life. He arrived at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. Not because he was eager, but because timing mattered. He wanted to be seated before the judge entered, wanted Whitmore to see him the moment he stepped onto that bench. Bumpy wore the charcoal suit, black tie, polished shoes that clicked softly against the marble floor as he walked through the entrance. His hat was tilted just right, not aggressive, not submissive, just present. A few people in the lobby recognized him. Their eyes widened. A clerk looked up from her desk and froze mid-sentence. A lawyer in a cheap suit stopped walking and pretended to check his briefcase. Bumpy didn't acknowledge any of them. He just moved through the space like he owned it. Because in a way, he did. Courtroom 4B was on the second floor. Civil disputes, low-stakes cases. The kind of room that didn't usually draw attention. Today, it would. Bumpy pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room was half empty. A few lawyers shuffling papers, a bailiff standing near the judge's bench looking bored, a handful of people scattered in the gallery. Plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses. No one important. Until now. Bumpy walked slowly down the center aisle. His footsteps echoed in the quiet room. Every head turned. The bailiff's hand instinctively moved toward his belt, then stopped. The lawyers looked up, confused, trying to place the face. Bumpy didn't sit in the front. That would have been too obvious, too confrontational. He walked to the back row, far right side, directly in the judge's line of sight if Whitmore looked up from his bench. And then, Bumpy sat. He didn't slouch, didn't fidget, just sat with his hands folded in his lap, his back straight, his face calm, waiting. At 10 a.m. exactly, the bailiff stood. All rise. The Honorable Judge Harold Whitmore, presiding. Everyone stood. The side door opened and Judge Whitmore entered. He was a tall man, mid-50s, with thinning gray hair and the kind of face that looked stern even when he smiled. He wore his black robe like armor, like it made him more than what he was. He stepped up to the bench, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the docket in front of him. And then he looked up, and he saw Bumpy. For just a second, maybe less, his face changed. The confident mask cracked. His eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly like he was about to say something, then thought better of it. Bumpy didn't move. He just smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a threatening smile. Something in between, a smile that said, "I see you." Judge Whitmore blinked, looked down at his papers, cleared his throat. "Be seated." The room sat, but the air had changed. The lawyers felt it. The bailiff felt it. Even the people who didn't know who Bumpy was could sense something was off. Whitmore shuffled his papers, trying to regain composure. He called the first case. A landlord-tenant dispute. Routine. Boring. But his voice wavered. He stumbled over a name. Had to ask the plaintiff to repeat himself. His hands, normally steady, fidgeted with his gavel. And every few seconds his eyes flicked up. To the back row, to Bumpy. Bumpy didn't do anything, that was the point. He didn't glare, didn't whisper to anyone, didn't make a scene. He just sat there, watching, calm, present. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from knowing something, from holding power that doesn't need to be spoken. At one point, Whitmore tried to ignore him, focused hard on the case in front of him, asking questions, making notes. But his pen slipped. He had to ask a lawyer to repeat a statement. His voice cracked mid-sentence. A few people in the gallery started whispering. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. The bailiff glanced toward the back row, then back at the judge. Then he'd worked in this courthouse for years. He knew tension when he saw it. And this was tension. 20 minutes into the session, Bumpy shifted in his seat. Just a small movement, crossing one leg over the other, adjusting his cuffs. Judge Whitmore's eyes snapped to him like a magnet, and Bumpy smiled again. Slow, deliberate. Whitmore's hand trembled. He set down his gavel and took a sip of water, but the glass rattled against his teeth. One of the lawyers noticed. "Your Honor, are you all right?" Whitmore nodded quickly. Too quickly. "Fine, I'm fine. Let's continue." But he wasn't fine. Everyone in that room could see it. The session dragged on, case after case. But Whitmore's focus was gone. He ruled too quickly on one dispute, too slowly on another. He dismissed a case without explanation, and drawing confused looks from both sides. And through it all, Bumpy just sat there, silent, still, smiling. By the time the judge called for a recess, his forehead was slick with sweat. He stood abruptly, almost knocking over his water glass, and disappeared into his chambers without a word. The bailiff looked confused. The lawyers exchanged glances, and Bumpy Johnson stood, adjusted his hat, and walked out of the courtroom. He didn't say goodbye, didn't acknowledge anyone. He'd done what he came to do. He'd reminded Judge Harold Whitmore of something he'd forgotten. In Harlem, the robe doesn't make you untouchable. Respect does. And Whitmore had none left. Chapter 4. The smile that spoke Bumpy didn't need words. He never had. In a world where most men shouted to be heard, Bumpy understood something deeper. Silence has weight. A look can carry more threat than a gun. And a smile, the right kind of smile, can break a man faster than violence ever could. That smile in the courtroom wasn't random. It wasn't casual. It was calculated. It was a message written in a language only certain men understood. And Judge Harold Whitmore understood it perfectly. The moment Bumpy left the courthouse, the whispers started. In the hallway outside courtroom 4B, a young lawyer leaned toward his colleague. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "Bumpy Johnson. He was sitting in the back." The other lawyer's face went pale. "Bumpy Johnson? Here? Why?" "I don't know, but Whitmore saw him, and he lost it." They weren't the only ones talking. By lunchtime, half the courthouse staff had heard. Bumpy Johnson attended Judge Whitmore's session. Didn't say a word, just sat there, smiled. And the judge fell apart. Back in his chambers, Whitmore sat behind his desk, staring at nothing. His hands were still shaking. He told himself it was nothing, just a coincidence. Bumpy Johnson was a citizen. He had every right to attend a public court session. It didn't mean anything. But he knew better. Men like Bumpy didn't show up for no reason. They didn't sit in courtrooms just to watch civil disputes. They didn't smile unless they wanted you to know something. And that smile, God, that smile, it was burned into Whitmore's mind. "I know what you did." That's what it said, clear as if Bumpy had spoken the words aloud. "I know about the envelope. I know about the $3,000. I know you sold out those men, and I know you thought you'd get away with it." Whitmore poured himself a drink, whiskey, straight. And his hand shook so badly he spilled some on his desk. He tried to think rationally. What could Bumpy actually do? He hadn't threatened him, hadn't approached him, hadn't done anything illegal. That was the problem. Bumpy didn't need to do anything illegal. By evening, word had spread beyond the courthouse, in barbershops, in bars, in the streets. Bumpy went to Whitmore's courtroom. Just sat there, didn't say a word. Judge couldn't even finish the session properly. That smile, man, I heard it was cold. The story grew with each telling, as stories do. But the core remained the same. Bumpy Johnson had sent a message, and everyone knew what it meant. Whitmore was marked, not for death. Bumpy didn't operate like that, not unless he had to, but marked in a different way. Marked as someone who'd been seen, and someone who'd been judged, someone who now lived under the weight of knowing that the most powerful man in Harlem had his number. And in Harlem, that was worse than a death sentence, because you had to live with it. The lawyers who'd paid Whitmore heard about it too. 3 men in expensive suits, sitting in a downtown office, got the call from one of their informants. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Bumpy knows about Whitmore." Silence on the line, then, "How do you know?" He showed up at the courthouse, made his presence known. Whitmore's rattled. More silence. Can we protect him? Protect him from what? Bumpy didn't threaten him, didn't touch him, just showed up. Then what's the problem? The informant sighed. You don't understand how Harlem works. Bumpy doesn't need to threaten people, and he just needs them to know he's watching. And now Whitmore knows. That judge is compromised. If he panics, if he talks, he won't talk. You sure about that? Because right now he's scared. And scared men do stupid things. The lawyers hung up. They'd paid good money to bury that case. They'd been assured it was handled, clean, quiet. Now Bumpy Johnson was involved. And nothing involving Bumpy Johnson stayed quiet. That night, Whitmore couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. That smile. What did it mean exactly? Was it a warning? A promise? A test? Would Bumpy come after him? Would he send someone? Or was this psychological? Just letting Whitmore destroy himself from the inside out? He thought about running, resigning, leaving the city entirely. But he knew that wouldn't work either. Men like Bumpy had long memories and long reach. If Whitmore ran, it would confirm his guilt. It would make him look weak. And in a city like New York, weakness was blood in the water. No, running wasn't an option. But neither was staying. The next morning, Whitmore didn't go to the courthouse. He called in sick, told his clerk he had a fever, needed a few days. The clerk was surprised. Whitmore never missed work. But she didn't push. What she didn't know was that Whitmore spent that day making calls, quiet calls, to the men who'd paid him, to a lawyer he trusted, to a friend in the police department, trying to figure out his next move. But every conversation ended the same way. Stay calm. Don't do anything stupid. And for God's sake, stay away from Bumpy Johnson. As if he had a choice. Meanwhile, Bumpy went about his day like nothing had happened. He met with his numbers runners, checked in on a few businesses, had lunch at a diner on Lenox Avenue. People greeted him warmly, respectfully, the way they always did. But now there was something extra. A look in their eyes, a nod that said, "We heard what you did." Bumpy didn't acknowledge it, didn't need to. He'd done what needed to be done. He'd reminded a corrupt judge that Harlem was watching, that betrayal had consequences, that no robe, no title, no amount of money could protect you from the truth. And the truth was simple. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's smile was more dangerous than most men's guns. Because a gun could kill you once. But that smile stayed with you. Haunted you. I ate at you from the inside until you broke yourself. Judge Harold Whitmore was already breaking, and Bumpy hadn't even started yet. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. 3 days passed. 3 days of Judge Harold Whitmore sitting in his home, curtains drawn, phone ringing off the hook. 3 days of him staring at that envelope in his mind. The one he should have never touched. 3 days of that smile haunting him every time he closed his eyes. On the 4th day, something broke. It started quietly. A clerk at the courthouse noticed something unusual. The Jenkins case, the one that had been dismissed 2 weeks prior, was being reviewed. Not by Whitmore, by someone higher up. An internal inquiry. Someone had filed a complaint, anonymous, but detailed, very detailed. It mentioned the dismissal, the timing, and the suspicious lack of evidence examination. It didn't name Whitmore directly, didn't accuse him of anything specific, but it asked questions. And questions in a system built on appearances were dangerous. The lawyers who'd paid Whitmore got word within hours. They met again, same office, different mood. Who filed the complaint? We don't know, it's anonymous. Bumpy? Probably, or someone connected to him. One of the lawyers, the oldest, leaned back in his chair. He'd been in this game long enough to know when a hand was lost. We need to cut ties immediately. What about Whitmore? What about him? He took the money. He made the decision. If this goes sideways, he's on his own. He could talk. He won't. He's in too deep. If he admits to taking a bribe, his career's over. He'll protect himself by staying quiet. The younger lawyer wasn't convinced. And if Bumpy pushes harder? The old man smiled, cold, calculating. Then Whitmore will realize he has two choices: resign quietly and disappear, or fight and lose everything. Either way, he's done. We move on. But Bumpy wasn't moving on. He was watching. Marcus came to him 5 days after the courtroom visit. They met at the same booth in Jocko's. The inquiry's open. Whitmore's being looked at. Bumpy nodded, sipped his drink. Who filed it? Officially, anonymous. But the complaint came through a lawyer who owes you a favor. Bumpy allowed himself a small smile. And Whitmore? He hasn't been back to the courthouse since you showed up. Word is he's panicking. The downtown boys cut him loose. He's alone. Good. Marcus hesitated. You want me to? No. Bumpy's voice was firm, not loud, just absolute. We don't touch him. We don't go near him. He's going to destroy himself. You sure? Bumpy looked at him. That same calm, unreadable expression. Men like Whitmore don't need help falling apart. They just need to know they've been seen. The rest takes care of itself. He was right. A week later, the envelope surfaced. Not the physical one, but the paper trail. An investigator working the internal inquiry found bank records, a deposit into Whitmore's account. $3,000, same week that Jenkins' case was dismissed. The deposit was clean. Didn't directly tie to the bribe, but the timing was too convenient. And in a world where perception mattered more than proof, it was enough. Whitmore was called in for questioning. He sat across from two senior court officials, his lawyer beside him, and tried to explain. That was a personal loan from a friend. It has nothing to do with any case. What friend? He gave a name. Someone real. Someone who could theoretically back up his story. But the officials weren't stupid. We'll need to verify that. In the meantime, Judge Whitmore, we're recommending you take a leave of absence, pending the outcome of this review. It wasn't a request. The news hit the streets within hours. Judge Whitmore suspended, under investigation. The Jenkins case reopened. In Harlem, people didn't need the details. They understood what had happened. Bumpy had moved, quietly, strategically, without breaking a single law. And the system had bent. 2 weeks later, the bribe money was returned. Not publicly, not officially. Damn, but it showed up. An anonymous donation to a Harlem community fund. $3,000. Exact. No one asked where it came from. Everyone knew. The downtown lawyers who'd paid Whitmore got the message. They pulled out of Harlem entirely, moved their operations to Brooklyn, to Queens, anywhere but here, because Harlem wasn't worth it anymore. Not when Bumpy Johnson was watching. The Jenkins boys, the two men whose case had been buried, walked free. Not because the charges were dropped, but because the prosecution's case fell apart under scrutiny. Evidence that had been lost suddenly reappeared. Witnesses who'd been unavailable came forward. The trial was fair this time, and fairness in Harlem usually meant justice. They were acquitted within a month. When they left the courthouse, free men, they saw Bumpy standing across the street, just standing there, watching. They nodded to him, respectful, grateful. Bumpy nodded back. Then he turned and walked away. Judge Harold Whitmore resigned 6 weeks after Bumpy sat in his courtroom. The official statement cited health reasons, stress, blood pressure, the demands of the job. No one believed it, but no one challenged it either. Whitmore left New York entirely, moved to Pennsylvania, took a teaching job at a small law school, kept his head down, lived quietly. He never forgot that smile. Some nights, decades later, he'd wake up in a cold sweat seeing it. That calm, deliberate smile. That quiet promise. I see you. He'd broken the rules, betrayed the community, sold out justice for $3,000. And Bumpy Johnson had made sure he paid for it. Not with violence, not with death, but with something worse. The knowledge that he'd been seen, judged, and found wanting. and that his entire life after that moment existed only because Bumpy had chosen mercy over vengeance. That was the weight Whitmore carried. Every single day. Chapter 6. Legacy of Restraint. Years later, long after Judge Harold Whitmore had left New York, long after the lawyers who paid him had moved on to other schemes, long after the Jenkins boys had rebuilt their lives, people still talked about what happened in Courtroom 4B. Not as gossip, as legend. The story got told in barbershops, in late-night conversations over drinks, in warnings given to young men who thought power came from loudness, from violence, from making examples. Old-timers would lean back, take a slow sip, and say, "You want to know what real power looks like? Let me tell you about the time Bumpy Johnson sat in a courtroom and smiled." And they'd tell it. Every detail. The envelope, the corrupt judge, the quiet walk into the courthouse. That smile. But more than the facts, they'd tell what it meant. Because that moment, that single act of restraint, said everything about who Bumpy Johnson was. And more importantly, who he wasn't. He wasn't a thug, wasn't a mindless gangster who solved problems with bullets. He could have had Whitmore killed, could have sent someone to rough him up, could have burned down his house, threatened his family, made it loud and bloody in public. That's what most men in his position would have done. But Bumpy understood something they didn't. Violence is easy. Control is hard. Anyone can destroy. It takes no intelligence, no strategy, no vision. You just pull a trigger. You just throw a punch. You just break things until people fear you. But fear is temporary. Respect is forever. And respect doesn't come from what you destroy. It comes from what you choose not to destroy. Bumpy had built Harlem on that principle. In a world where black men were expected to fight each other, destroy each other, tear each other down for scraps, Bumpy had built something different. He'd built a community, not a perfect one, not a clean one. Crime still existed, violence still happened. Harlem was still Harlem, rough around the edges, dangerous in places, unforgiving if you crossed the wrong line, but it was organized, it was protected, it was ours, and that mattered. The numbers racket that Bumpy ran, it wasn't just illegal gambling. It was economic independence. Money that stayed in black hands, money that funded black businesses, black schools, black families. The deals he made, they weren't just about profit. They were about keeping outside interests from carving up Harlem like it was territory to be conquered. The respect he commanded, it wasn't just about fear. It was about trust. People knew that if they came to Bumpy with a problem, he'd handle it. Fairly, thoughtfully, without unnecessary bloodshed. That's why the Whitmore situation mattered so much. Because it wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about a system that thought it could buy Harlem. That thought it could plant its people in positions of power and control the outcomes. That thought black lives, black freedom, black justice was for sale. And Bumpy reminded them, no, it's not. There's a difference between a gangster and a leader. A gangster takes. A leader protects. A gangster rules through fear. A leader earns loyalty. A gangster burns bridges. A leader builds them. Bumpy Johnson was a leader. He understood that every action sent a message. Every decision set a precedent. Every time he chose violence, he told the community, this is how we solve problems. And every time he chose restraint, he told them, we're better than that. The Whitmore incident became a teaching moment, a story passed down not just as entertainment, but as instruction. Young men coming up in Harlem would hear it and learn, you don't always have to be the loudest in the room. You don't always have to prove yourself with violence. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is show up, be seen, nay, and let your presence speak for itself. That smile in the courtroom, it wasn't arrogance. It wasn't cruelty. It was confidence. The confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was, who knew his power didn't come from what he could do to people, but from what he could do for them. Decades after Bumpy's death, historians and writers would try to capture what he meant to Harlem. Some called him a criminal. They weren't wrong. He broke laws. He ran illegal operations. He lived in a world of violence and corruption. But others called him a protector, and they weren't wrong either. Because Bumpy existed in the space between what the law said and what justice required. In a system that denied black people access to legitimate power, Bumpy created his own. In a city that treated black neighborhoods as places to exploit, and Bumpy built walls of protection. In a world that told black men they were worthless, Bumpy walked with his head high and reminded everyone, we matter. The Whitmore story became a perfect encapsulation of that philosophy. A black man with no official power, no badge, no title, walked into a courthouse, sat down, and through sheer presence, through the weight of his reputation, through the respect he'd earned over decades, forced the system to correct itself. He didn't burn it down. He didn't tear it apart. He just reminded it that he was watching. And that was enough. There's a moment in every leader's life when they have to choose, do I destroy my enemy, or do I let them destroy themselves? The first option is satisfying. It's immediate. It feels like justice. But the second option is smarter. It's cleaner, so it leaves no blood on your hands. And more importantly, it sends a message that lasts longer than any act of violence ever could. Bumpy chose the second option. He could have had Whitmore killed. The streets would have understood. Hell, they might have expected it. But then what? Another judge gets appointed. Another one who thinks he can be bought. Another cycle of corruption and violence. Instead, Bumpy did something more powerful. He made an example without making a martyr. Whitmore lived, but he lived in shame. He lived knowing that his corruption had been exposed, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, all without Bumpy lifting a finger. And every other judge, every other lawyer, every other official who thought about taking a bribe in Harlem after that, they remembered. They remembered that smile. And they remembered that Bumpy didn't need to kill you to ruin you. He just needed to see you. In the years that followed, Harlem changed. Other players came and went, other gangsters, other crews, other men who thought they could take Bumpy's place. Some were more violent, some were flashier, some made more noise. But none of them commanded the same respect. Because respect isn't given, it's earned. And it's earned through consistency, through principle, through showing day after day, year after year, that you stand for something bigger than yourself. Bumpy stood for Harlem, not the Harlem of tourist brochures or jazz clubs or cultural movements, though he was part of all that. He stood for the Harlem that struggled, the Harlem that survived, the Harlem that refused to be broken, bought, or buried. And when he walked into that courtroom and smiled at Judge Whitmore, he wasn't just defending two men who'd been wronged. He was defending an idea that we deserve better, that we demand better, and that will hold you accountable when you fail us. Legacy isn't built in moments of violence. It's built in moments of restraint. Anyone can pull a trigger. Anyone can throw a punch. Anyone can burn something down. But it takes wisdom to know when not to. It takes strength to hold power and choose not to use it. It takes vision to see beyond the immediate satisfaction of revenge and understand the long-term value of principle. Bumpy Johnson had that wisdom, that strength, that vision. And that's why decades after his death, people still tell stories about him. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a villain, but as a king. A king who ruled not through fear, but through respect. A king who understood that real power doesn't announce itself. It just is. A king who could walk into a courtroom, sit in the back row, smile, and change everything. Judge Harold Whitmore spent the rest of his life trying to forget that smile. He never could, because it wasn't just a smile. It was a mirror. And in that moment, Whitmore saw himself for what he truly was, a man who sold his integrity for $3,000. A man who thought his position made him untouchable. A man who forgot that in Harlem, justice doesn't come from a gavel, it comes from the people. And the people had a protector. His name was Bumpy Johnson. And he didn't need to say a word to make you remember it. The story ends the way all great stories do. not with an explosion, and not with bloodshed, but with the truth. Power isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you choose to protect. Bumpy Johnson protected Harlem. Not perfectly, not without compromise, not without getting his hands dirty. But he protected it. And when a corrupt judge tried to sell it out, Bumpy didn't respond with violence. He responded with presence. He sat in a courtroom, he smiled, and the world bent. Because that's what legends do. They don't shout. They don't threaten. They just show up. And everything changes. Years from now, when someone asks what made Bumpy Johnson different, the answer will be simple. He knew when to fight. And more importantly, he knew when not to. That courtroom smile wasn't the beginning of something. It was the proof of everything he'd already built. A legacy, not of violence, no, but of power. Real power. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. The kind that just is. And in Harlem, that power had a name. Bumpy Johnson. The man who could change your life with a smile.